like to ask Rudy Bankston. Brother Rudy, you're on the call, right? Let's hear.
Yes.
You have some special. I understand. How are you doing? It's been a while since I've seen you. So let's. I hear you have some special connection with our guest speaker today.
Yeah, Carolyn called me yesterday and invited me, so I appreciate that. And you don't say no to Carolyn, and at least I don't. So she put me in on that. And when she first said the name of the keynote speaker, I thought she said Jenny Verche. Even though she said Janine Geske, I heard Jenny because I didn't make that connection to it. So we're still talking and she's still talking. And I'm like, wait a minute, who did you say? And then I realized it was Janine Geske. And I met Janine Geske in Green Bay Correctional Institution around 2009. And I was a part of a program called Challenges and Possibilities. And midway through this program, it's probably like it was a 3-month program. And midway through, we have a portion for 3 days called Restorative Justice, where community members come in, and there were probably 15 or 20 or so men who were incarcerated at Green Bay Correctional Institution, and maybe 15 or so community members, and we stood in this. We hung out for 3 days, and when I came a little later, so when I showed up, um, the only seat that I saw left was next to Janine Geske, and at the time I was not fond of judges. I was serving a life sentence. I was looking to die in prison. How things were set up. So I'm like, oh my. So she didn't know, but I came over there like, man, I got to sit next to the judge. How's this gonna go? But within those 3 days, for me, I had to rehumanize her as a judge, and oftentimes, as folks who are incarcerated, or just as a Black person in America, we're always fighting for our humanity, especially in this American context. But during that time, we sat next to each other. We stole conversations. In fact, after the first day, I went over to her. I don't know if she recalls any of this, but I went over to her and said, I really appreciate sitting next to a judge versus in front of one for the first time in my life. But we stole conversations as the group started, and we had funny moments when she turned to me and asked, so where are you from? In Milwaukee. And I said, I'm from the 30s. And that means you're from like 30th Street to up to whatever. And she said, oh, art deco. And she had thought I was talking about a art movement from I think the 1930s. So there were those moments, but there were also those moments of just rehumanization. And but that moment always stayed with me, because within that space for the first time, and I shared it with the group, it was the first time I felt a sense of community in a long time, and that says a lot inside of a institution. And just for her to know today, I'm living in Madison. My case got back in court, um, and I'm living in Madison. A part of me getting my case back in court, I was given 25. My life sentence was converted to 25 years in this past May. I'm off parole. I registered to vote for the first time, looking forward to voting. And I will vote in person because I know the history connected with what Black people had to do to get that right. So I will walk in that booth and feel that sense of history. And today I do restorative justice work in education through an anti-racism lens, and I work um, I have a LLC, but prior to that, I was working in the Madison School District. Now I contract with districts around the state and just doing this work. And I share all that not to brag, but more so to say how important the work that of course Janine and what she does out of Marquette, and just going inside prisons and allowing folks to feel their humanity despite feeling dehumanized every day. But also to each of you who are doing such critical work and continuing to grow. I love hearing that Moses is taking on a more racial justice stance. That's growth for me within the 5 years of what I've witnessed with, and I hope that that continues to be a hard push because race and racism is at the forefront of folks' mind due to George Floyd and everything that's going on. But it's always so easy to revert to what everyone is comfortable with. So I hope that work continues to be done in both bold and radical way. And I say radical as Sister Angela Davis said, describes it as grasping at the root and really bringing forth what we need to bring forth. So good to be in the space. And again, thank you, Carolyn, for everything you've done for me in my transition. That's a whole nother story, but Carolyn has played a pivotal role in where I am today, especially since I hit Madison. So always want to honor her as well.
Amen. Rudy, you are so clearly and cogently. These are very important issues, and the way you described it and bring out Angela Davis's definition is really inspiring to me. And I
Mhm.
hope that we can, in fact, we will, in fact, continue on this work within Moses of bringing racial justice. So next, I'd like to talk to Jerry Hancock because you also have a particular perspective on and connection with our guest speaker.
Hello, and I certainly do. Like Rudy, I met Janine Geske in prison at Green Bay, I think 17 years ago, and she changed my life. And that change has led to my becoming an ordained minister and beginning the prison ministry project and using the tools that she taught us in Green Bay. We have been doing restorative justice in Wisconsin prisons for the past 12 years. More than 1,000 men and women have graduated from our programs. And it's all because of what Janine Geske taught us, sitting on plastic chairs in a very cold room in Green Bay. So I am personally grateful to Janine, and I want to express the gratitude of the more than 1,000 people that have graduated from restorative justice to Janine Geske. So this is a big deal to have.
Thank you, Jerry. I agree. This work is so important. I mean, you all know better than I, you have been doing the work personally for so many years. And now let's return to Sister Joan and maybe Carolyn. We'll move on. Well, thank you all for this conversation of the past half hour. And we'll move on to the main course, as it were, of this event. Here we go.
Okay. And thanks for all of you for joining. And yes, and Carolyn's going to do a formal introduction now of Janine. And before she starts, though, we've talked about how to handle that there will be questions from you all. And so what we would like you to do is, as Janine talks, if you have a question, rather than coming out with it, if you'd put it in the chat. And Ann Lacey is here and she's going to monitor the chat. And so when Janine's ready for questions, she will bring the questions forth that you put in the chat. So you won't have to be worried about when your turn is. So thank you, Carolyn.
Sister Joan, I'm sorry, I forgot. Rachel had said she had one announcement she wanted to make.
Okay, let's get Rachel, and then Carolyn, you be ready to come on right after that. Thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to say that on November 21st is our gala, and more important than being a fundraiser is where we honor 3 people who have been previously incarcerated, and it's called Transformation celebration gala where we celebrate 3 people who are now out and giving back to the community in meaningful ways. So be looking for the registration for that. And with that, I'll give it back to who, Carolyn? Carolyn, thank you.
Carolyn, you're muted.
Okay, I'm not going to make a formal introduction exactly, but thank you for asking me to be part of this. I've been a member of Moses almost since the beginning, and we have a thing called one-on-ones in Moses. And at a table in the basement of Jerry's church, Talib Akibar and I were sitting at the same table. He had a long braid and a stocking cap, and we turned to each other with the question of, why are you in Moses? Why are you joining Moses? And we both said at the same time to each other, because if we weren't in Moses, we would not ever talk to each other. The important thing to me about Moses has been the opportunity to walk with not only people that you are like and you know and you understand from inside and from an insider group, but across the table, and to reach out and to be able to walk together. I think it's our only answer. Life has only gotten more polarized and the prisons more full instead of more diminished. We had the highest rate of incarceration anywhere in the world here in Wisconsin, and the intolerable practice of long-term solitary confinement. And these are mostly of people who have either drug, mental health, or injustice sentences, many of whom. And so the fear mongering of don't let these terrible other people on the streets has been a roadblock to our humanity and our growing as a community. I met Janine Geske way back in the 90s when I first moved here from Washington, D.C. I'm not sure she even remembers. I was on a different crusade at that time about the danger to families of not acknowledging the balance between work and home in dual career families, as if there doesn't need to be a parent. And we were talking about doing some retreats at our hilltop home that we had moved to in the mental health profession. And we talked about organizing some things and mostly just had an opportunity to get to know each other. And since then, I've followed her going on to, she may have at the same time been already doing the Marquette projects. And we haven't continued to weave together, but I'm going to ask her to tell you the important things about how she came to be where she is. And I also want to add that all of Milwaukee seems to be influenced by her, because they have a school that's run on a restorative justice model. The police are being trained in restorative justice practices. And someone told me that Milwaukee has declared itself aiming to become a criminal justice city. So I will turn it over to Janine to add to my introduction her particular journey to coming to the work she's doing today. Janine.
Thank you, Carolyn. And hello, everybody. What a wonderful opening this has been. I want to begin by talking to Rudy. I don't remember our conversation. I am thrilled to learn about what's happened in your life. You know, that was the goal of the whole project, and to find that, you know, so long ago you were sitting next to me and now you're out, a colleague doing the work in the community, is just wonderful. And I'm glad that things have worked out for you and that you've used your gifts in a positive way and be able to use your knowledge and experience, because that is worth so much to the communities that we all need to serve. So thank you for the introduction. And I thought you were going to say, because I have said to people, men sitting next to me, where are you from? And they would say Milwaukee, and I'd say, oh yeah, and they say, yeah, you put me here, which was usually a conversation stopper. You know, I didn't quite know what to say after they said that. So I was glad to hear I was only talking about Art Deco with you, and not, not that I was responsible for incarcerating you. But thank you so much for the introduction and for being here. And my dear, dear friend, Jerry Hancock, we have not had the chance in the last several years to be together, but we've spent many, many times together. And I think most of them have been in behind bars. But we've had rich experiences, and I've learned from Jerry, and Jerry's learned from me. And that's how this all works, right? That's how community grows. I'd like to take responsibility for things turning into restorative justice. I can't do that. I did what I did. And, you know, it's the ripples we talk about, bad ripples coming from harm. Well, good ripples come from good work. And when people do good work, it ripples out and there's more good work done. So let me talk a little bit about my background in answer to Carolyn, and to tell you a little bit how I got involved. I apologize. I've been sick the last several days, and I've taken a COVID test, and of course I haven't gotten the results. So, but at least I know I can't give it to you this way. So if I have it, I'll just go back to bed. But I'm happy to be with you. I put this flower here today because we had talked about having a flower, and you know, this is funny. This is a Christmas cactus that decided that this was Christmas, and it just went into full bloom. And I thought, you know, during these dark days before the election, with all the tension, with all the COVID, it's nice to have some beautiful flowers to remind us about God's goodness and beauty. So, yeah, hopefully you're enjoying the flowers as well. I am also an educator. I was born and raised in Cedarburg, a very small white community. And my parents were both school teachers. And that's really, excuse me, what I wanted to do. I went to college, got a master's in education, teaching elementary ed. I taught sixth grade for a while. And at some point decided I wanted to do something different. And I decided to go to law school. I'd never met a lawyer before I went to law school. I didn't know any lawyers, but I applied and wound up graduating. And I started out at Legal Aid Society in Milwaukee, representing people in civil matters who could not afford counsel. And that really was the best beginning to my career, because I learned to be with and in solidarity with people in poverty and in trouble and having huge legal and social problems. And I learned so much from that rich experience that I still draw on that from those 3 years of walking those journeys with all sorts of civil litigation. I won't bother with some of my other steps, but I eventually, at a very young age, became a trial court judge in Milwaukee. I was only 32 at the time. I'd been out 6 years, and it was by fortune and Governor Dreyfus who decided to appoint a woman at that point. There weren't many of us around, and he appointed me to the bench. What I had learned about the court system as being a legal aid lawyer was the important to have that system for all people to have a place to deal with conflict. Because whether my clients were treated respectfully or disrespectfully, whether we got a fair hearing or not a fair hearing, absolutely absorbed everything that my clients had. And if there was not at least a fair shot in the court system, the only alternative was something on the streets. And I learned the importance of listening. I learned the importance of being respectful to people, to making sure that even if they lost a court proceeding, that they understood at least why the judge was ruling the way the judge was ruling, or the jury had done what the jury did. And so that was really how I started judging, and part of it was my teaching desire to teach people about the system. Early on, a teacher that Jerry and I know well, and Rudy as well, a woman by the name of Jenny Vandenbranen, who was running Challenges and Possibilities, came and sat in the back of my courtroom one day. She didn't know me, and she came up to me and said, "I'd like you to come teach the class for me." And I work in the prisons. And we laugh about this because I said, well, you know, I'm really busy. I had 3 children. I had a busy life. I said, I'll come once. That's it. I'll come once. And so now that's probably in the thousands of times I've been there. But at that time, it was going to be once. And what I found by going to the prisons and teaching classes for a while, I wasn't in restorative justice initially, was my desire to learn what happened in the prisons after I had incarcerated people. Now, I wasn't following the people that I had sentenced, but I got to see what programs were offered or not offered, what the cells were like, what the food was like, what the experience. I had opportunities to talk to inmates, both male and female, depending on the prison I was in. And it became really an important part of my judging, is to understand that. Because a other part of my judging responsibilities were teaching judges. And I taught judges from around the country about how to judge. I taught them about sentencing. I taught them about community relations. I taught them about victims. And what I learned often in the prisons, I carried with me into those classes with judges at a national judicial college. I also, during that time, as I spent more and more time in criminal court, I was a judge there for 12 years and 9 years were in criminal, began spending more time with victim and survivor groups and neighborhood groups, all of whom are part of restorative justice, but I didn't know it then. And the reason, again, I thought it was important to spend time with consumers of the court system, whoever they were, whether it was victims, whether it was community, whether it was people who were charged and their families. I wanted to be able to understand how we could do our job better. And so I learned a lot. And at some point, and it's a long story, Jerry knows it, I was asked to sit in a restorative justice course at Green Bay by my mentor at the time, Bruce Kittle, who was at University of Wisconsin and who was a minister, just like Jerry, and was starting to do some restorative justice. And I sat in his program for 3 days and absolutely was transformed. I mean, I talk about that being a key moment in my whole life because I was so touched by the process. And it came to be that I started co-facilitating that 3 days. And then Bruce left and I ran the program. And I don't know if it's 15 years or 16 years, I ran the program several times a year, probably one of the early times when Rudy was there. And what I learned, and I'm going to talk about that process, then I'll back up and talk about restorative justice a little bit, was we came together in community of, we call them the men in green, but the people that were incarcerated, I would bring in 10 to 15, sometimes 20 community members. I would bring in what we call surrogate survivors, that is survivors of violent crime, who would describe what happened to them during the crime and the aftermath and the ripples of harm. And then we had law students and a variety of other people. And the whole idea is that we represented the different aspects of restorative justice. And for 3 days, we would do a talking circle. And I suspect 90% of you all know about a talking circle and talking piece. But it gave us all a chance to be equals in the room. There was no priority other than me being the circle keeper. But other than that, we would pass the talking piece and people would share stories. And it wouldn't take us long to be changed from us and them into us. And I can tell you invariably, I did lots of these circles, that by the end of the 3 days, the men would often not want the 3 days to end. They absolutely loved this sense of community and opportunity to talk, even though there'd been tough talk. The community members were amazed at the men, like many, you've had experience with men in prison or women in prison, but a lot of people haven't. And so to find out the humanity and the backgrounds and the lives that have been lived by people who are incarcerated, but also the survivors of violent crime who would come over and over again because they found healing in a maximum security prison and sharing their stories with people. And it was a profound experience. Now let me back up and talk about restorative justice for 5 or 10 minutes. It's sort of my definition, which it's defined differently in different places, but this is sort of a bedrock view of it, and it's pretty conservative in the sense that it doesn't include everything under the sun. Restorative justice is often drawn as a triangle, and the 3 points are: the top point is the victim survivor. That is, if there is a victim survivor of harm, they are at the top of the circle, of the triangle. The second point is community, and the third point is person who may have caused the harm on that point. So that's a classic easy triangle. And if you're dealing with what I call a simple crime, in that it's one person, one victim, one offender, you could put the names into it. A lot of harm is much more complex. So those are the 3 points. You ask a question in a restorative justice setting. The first question is, who was harmed by what happened? Now let me start with this. A lot of people associate restorative justice with crime. It is not tied to crime. There's lots of kinds of harm that are not criminal. We've talked about some of them: racial injustice, discrimination, betrayal, all sorts of things that we consider to be deep harms in our society that are not criminal because no legislature has made it criminal. And there's no reason restorative justice has to be limited to crime. The reason it gets in that box sometimes is that it gets affiliated with the criminal justice system, and then you have it touching a crime. But when I'm talking about it's harm, so we can use it, and I'll talk a little bit about all the different uses. There are all sorts of different uses of restorative justice when you talk about the harm. So if you've been betrayed by a partner or a loved one, you have been deeply harmed even though there's no crime. And it's clear that you are the one, when we're talking about this, who are the victim survivor, and then there's an individual who has caused the harm. So the first question is, who was harmed? Now, when we look at, let's take a crime victim, let's take a sexual assault survivor. Clearly, in the classic criminal justice system, we say, who is that? Oops, sorry, who is that? And we say, well, that's the sexual assault survivor. But if any of you know somebody who's been assaulted, you know that that isn't the only person who's been impacted by that crime. That person's partner, their friends, their children, their acquaintances, their neighbors, that ripples through that. Ask the children of somebody who's been sexually assaulted, and they will describe they have a different mother than they had before the time of the assault. Their parents will describe their children as different. Their partner will describe their relationship as different. So I always talked about those ripples. And so even when you're describing who is harmed, you wind up looking at those various ripples. And, you know, for example, burglary, which is often called a property crime. Why is it called a property crime? Because the elements are somebody with intent to steal enters a building or intends to commit a felony. That sounds like a lot of property. But if you talk to the victim of that burglary, it's not the fact that somebody entered without consent. It's that they've been violated. Their home has been violated. Their sacred space has been violated. They no longer feel safe there. There is all sorts of actual harm to a victim of a burglary, even though maybe nothing was taken or nothing big was taken. And so you're looking at what is the actual harm? What is the harm to a sexual assault survivor? Anybody that says, well, there are no cuts or bruises, so they weren't harmed, doesn't know a sexual assault survivor. The cuts and bruises heal quickly. The other harm does not. As one survivor in one of Jerry's classes used to say, there is no rape kit in the world that'll take care of the harm that happened during my sexual assault. My life was changed. And so you're looking at those harms. All right, now we're looking at, so we're on that part of the triangle. We go to the second part of the triangle is community. And I describe things as little community, big community. They're different terms, but little community is people that are closely around. So if there are a bunch of burglaries in your neighborhood, it will impact you, even if you don't know the people. You'll lock your doors, you'll be more careful. You may be profiling a little bit when you see people on the street. You may not feel safe there. You may leave your dog out. There are all sorts of things you might do. You might not be as traumatized as the burglary victims, but you're impacted. And so if you have sexual assaults in your neighborhood, it's worse. If there are other things bad happening in the neighborhood, it will happen. But then we can have bigger, right? We can have crimes that affect a whole community. You know, Madison's had crimes recently, whether it's police misconduct or whether it's other kind of criminal behavior. The whole community gets shaken. Everybody gets impacted somehow. So you can have a whole city or a larger part. And obviously, I always say the biggest example of community harm at the largest level is 9/11. Our lives changed on September 11th. The whole world changed that day because of some criminal acts of some individuals and an organization, but that changed the world. And so when you're looking at community harm, you're looking again at how has things changed, how has it been harmed. Then we take the third point on the triangle, which is very important. This is important to survivors when we're talking about this, is that this work is not offender focused or perpetrator focused. It's focused on the harm. That is the focus. We're looking at the person who made the choice or committed the crime. And they have been impacted, but they also, in theory, have set into motion the actions that cause the harm. So there's accountability, and I'm going to put that aside right now for that person. But we often forget, and in your organization, that the ripples around that person are immense. The parents of somebody who's been charged with a crime, the children of somebody who's incarcerated, their neighbors, maybe they had mentors, maybe they had employers, all sorts of people. And what the harm is can be different depending on people. But we often forget about the families of those who've been charged or convicted of offenses. And they too are part of the harm of the event. So the question is, first, who was harmed? And secondly, what was that harm? So you get back to neighborhoods, the harm can be people start selling their houses quickly. People start profiling people. Laws start change. And I used to tell the men, I don't know if Rudy remembers this, I used to say to the men, we are one homicide at the wrong political moment away from the death penalty in Wisconsin. Now we've moved a lot nationally, and I'm hoping that'll never happen. But we all know that when we put it on the ballot in Wisconsin, it was advisory, the great majority of people in Wisconsin wanted the death penalty. And it didn't happen because it wasn't it was the right political moment, in my view. It wasn't the wrong political moment for advocates, but it could have easily happened to us as it happened in many states. That's why, the impact of any wrongful action, and I used to tell some of the men and women who had been convicted of crimes, you will never know the impact of what you have done, but the impact of what others have done to you. Those impacts you understand. So we look at the impact and recognize it, give voice to it, let people have a chance to describe what has happened. It's one of the reasons that, having things taped and having people having voices and being able to give testimony is so critical, just like in South Africa, to give voice to the harm, whatever it may be. The third question is, what do we do about repairing the harm? And I use we because partially, if we can get a person who has committed harm involved in repairing it, that's an ideal. And sometimes it's little things like making restitution. Sometimes it's institutional change. Sometimes it's taking some other kind of action. So if we can get those that have to be held accountable to be able to do some change to make things better, then that's the ideal. But that doesn't let the community off the hook, because community is not only a victim of crime, but it also has responsibility to help repair it. The community has a responsibility to stand up for survivors, to support survivors, to give them support when they go through their healing journeys, and to protect them when they're having to go through proceedings. But the community also has a role vis-a-vis the person who's committed the crime, both in terms of holding accountability, but also in helping that person and the community repair the harm. So we do get community. The whole community comes together and works on that. So that's a quick, not quick enough, but quick definition of restorative justice. Let me run through a number of uses of restorative justice, and then I just as soon answer some questions. And I think that Jerry will have an opportunity to jump in. And I don't know if Ron Johnson is here, but if Ron is, I'd like to hear Ron too. When restorative justice started getting legs in the United States, it really started in juvenile cases. And actually, those are cases that make a lot of sense. It was to do what we call victim offender meetings, dialogues, sometimes mediation between a juvenile and somebody who's been juvenile and somebody who's been victimized. And to give you an example of a case that worked the way it was supposed to work, I was in Appleton at one point, and there was a news conference, and this couple came to talk to the police about their case. And what happened is some juveniles that were driving around Appleton and decided to mace some Jesus lovers, that was it. And it makes no sense, but often what juveniles do make no sense. And so they're driving around looking for somebody to shoot mace at. They don't find anybody. So they go out in the country and they find a farm where there's a great big Jesus loved you sign on the lawn. And two guys get out of the car, they go up to the front door, they ring the doorbell, and the husband answers the door, and they shoot the mace into his face and make some remark about Jesus and run off. So the police are called, an ambulance is called, he goes to the hospital, he has his eyes washed out. They eventually catch the juveniles. One was a guy who had had a number of priors, but there was a second guy who had no priors and had kind of gone along with it. And he wanted to meet with the victims. And the victims were very young. They were early 20s. They had 3 children already. And they didn't know why they wanted to meet with them, but finally the restorative justice people convinced them it was a good idea. And so they had a meeting, and the man started describing for the kid all the things that had happened, that he had been in excruciating pain. But after that, he worried about what would have happened if his children had answered the door, or his wife had answered the door. And he no longer felt comfortable in the farmhouse. His wife didn't want to be alone anymore. They had to get a big dog. Their children were terrified that night because of all that happened in the ambulance and the police, and they now would only sleep in their parents' bed. They wouldn't go into their own bedrooms. And so the couple were really talking to him about the terrible things that have happened as a result of their choices, and not being able to understand whatever prompted him to do this. Well, the kid was really touched by their stories and started crying, and then described how he got involved and how he did this not important. And he's just apologizing and telling him how sorry he is, and can he make it up, and is there something he could do? And then they're asking him about his background, and he had dropped out of high school, and talked to him about all those things. And at the end of that, they said to him, you know, all we want you to do is graduate from high school. That's what we want. We want you to sign a document today that's going to tell us that you will do everything you can to graduate from high school. Now that's not enforceable, right? And they can't enforce it. But he agreed to do that. and they signed it. And they were so thrilled with that meeting, having met him, no longer being afraid of him, being able to tell their children he's not coming back and that he's going to finish school because of the meeting they had with him, that they felt it gave new meaning to their Christian message. They felt that they really were able to use their faith in a positive way and were thrilled. And the one guy said, if I'd known so much good was going to come out of this, I would have been maced earlier. I'll never forget that. And the cops are going like, really? But the point of it is that those are the kinds of things. And the kid is much more likely to remember that meeting with him and the wife than he would have if he'd been in court where a judge said, this is terrible. I'm gonna put you on supervision. You have to make restitution of, $1,500 of hospital bills. Well, that never gets paid. And he never sees a probation agent because it's not that high in priority, and he goes on his whole way. The impact is diverse. And so that really is where a lot of restorative justice started and still happens in juvenile. Now, those of you who have mentioned you were teachers, a lot of it's happening in the schools. And it's being used for truancy, it's being used for bullying, it's being used for other misbehaviors in school. Try not to have to call the police, let them have a police contact, sometimes being arrested, and going through this whole process rather than trying to do a restorative approach. So there are many schools trying very hard to do a restorative approach so that the kids can understand, the kids that did whatever happened can have a new appreciation of the humanity, that human person they hurt, not that they violated a rule, they hurt somebody. And that's what I think the guys in prison slowly start to realize, that the crimes they committed hurt people. I know that a lot of the men that I encountered who had committed homicides, kind of said, well, I was dealing drugs, he was dealing drugs, we were in competing gangs, we were shooting at each other, and he died and I'm in prison. But then they'd say, I never thought about his mother. I never thought about that there's an empty plate at her Christmas table every year. I never thought about those children and his children and what they think about their dad that is dead. I never thought about my children and that my children were the victims of my crime because I'm not there for them. And so a whole realization that these offenses, this harm, may be about breaking a rule or breaking a law, but it's about hurting other human beings. And the humanity of it is what gives the soul to restorative justice. That's what touches people and impacts people. I can tell you that using restorative justice in racial issues, police, community issues, and I know that Ron Johnson has done some of that in Madison, it is absolutely critical. We did circles for 4 years on the north side and south side of Milwaukee, and I can tell you, to have a police officer describe holding a dying child in his arms and saying, I can never forget her, I take her with me every time somebody gets shot in Milwaukee. Or to have an inmate who comes out of prison, is paroled, and in a circle talking about having watched his mother murdered in front of him. Nobody leaves those circles thinking that those individuals fit the stereotypes they had before they walked in. That's not to say that there aren't bad cops and there aren't bad people and there aren't people, but there's so much behind all the humanity of the individuals. And that's what restorative justice does. And it does it by storytelling. It does it by people relating their experiences. So I always talk about when people are fighting politically, the question ought to be of the person that you disagree with, why do you believe that? What in your life has convinced you that that is the right path? And frankly, you ought to be asked that question yourself. Why do I feel so strongly about this? Because, we've done this with Israelis and Palestinians that are in the city, and, people won't agree on the remedy, but they can't argue with each other's stories, what's happened to their families, what's happened to their loved ones. I'm going to end by saying, this can be used in emotional conflicts. It's used in in office disputes, it's often religious disputes. Churches are using it. And a lot of what I've done the last several years has been involved in the pedophilia / abuse in the Catholic Church. I've been working a lot with survivors of that abuse. And let me just tell you a story about that because it's important. One of the things when you're looking at, for example, well, let's take a regular criminal case. If you take a sexual assault survivor, often they will tell you that even though somebody has assaulted them and it was horrible, the way the system treated them, whether it was the doctor at the hospital, whether it was the police officer, whether it was the judge, whether it was the district attorney, was traumatizing. It re-traumatized them and re-victimized them because they had hoped and believed that the system would be there for them, and they weren't. And there are hundreds of stories like that out there, and Jerry knows some of them because we had some of our victims talking about those. But it's true in the Catholic Church, and that's most of where the work has been that I've been doing, is most of the perpetrators of the abuse are deceased, elderly, senile, in denial. So there are very few victim offender dialogues that are happening on the clergy abuse front. But where the real anger is, and justified, is anger at the church, the hierarchy in the church and how it reacted to it. And so the restorative justice piece is the offender over here is the church, the institution of the church, whether it's the bishops or whether it's a pastor or sometimes it's officials in a particular parish, and then the survivor, and then the effect on the community is immense, and we could explore that in lots of different ways. There are a lot of information about there, and I'm going to stop talking because I do want to answer a few questions. But I wanted to give you a sense of the way we look at restorative justice. And so if we're just talking about rehabilitation of people who've been incarcerated, which is absolutely a wonderful thing, and I believe in it, and I'm a supporter of it. To me, that's not restorative justice. That's rehabilitation. That's or rehabilitation or sponsoring services. Restorative justice deals about restoring the harm, and harm. And if there's not a question about where are the people who were harmed by what happened in this process, and if the answer is they're not here, then there's something wrong, because then it's not restorative justice. And so it may be community, it may be institutions, it may be hierarchy, it could be lots of different things. But that is the framework in which you do restorative justice. I'm going to stop talking and answer questions. And I don't know, is somebody going to screen the questions for me?
Yes, I am going to. This is Moses host, and I will be stating the questions as they came in. So this is in the order that they were received, and we'll hope that we can get to all of them. So the first one is from Gil Halstead. Is it possible to build bridges between victim rights groups and groups like Moses that advocate for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people? If it is possible, how can we do it?
Okay, the answer is absolutely. And there are lots of examples of coalitions of survivor groups and people supporting those who've been incarcerated or convicted, working together on joint projects. There's a really good film, and I think it's called Cement. And I want to say it's out of Philadelphia, I'm not sure, but it's a film about creating a mural, and an artist, someone who did big murals outside, graphic mural, was having inmates create a mural, and they were creating it and they'd almost finished it, and a victims group heard about it and went ballistic because it represented all the people who had been convicted of things, but there was nothing about victims in it. And so they scrapped it and they started all over, and the victims group wound up coming into the prison and working jointly with the prisoners to create a big mural that incorporated both. You know, my experience is, and I'm sure it's all of yours, many, many, many of the people who are incarcerated were victims. They were victims as children. They were victims of a variety, whether it's sexual, whether it's physical, whether it was emotional. So they're all victims in there. And frankly, when a lot of victims hear and learn about individuals who have been convicted of crime and hear about their lives, they come to an understanding. They don't necessarily will absolve them of what they've done, but there's a new understanding. And so getting groups together, that can be a little challenging to get them together. But, you know, I think the right people who have the right mind to get groups together to talk about how you could collaborate on some things, I think would be, you know, how can we meet the needs of both groups? And it's not always going to meet the group, but you know what? They've used groups of pro-choice and pro-life people have used restorative justice to come together to use common language, not to call each other names. And so there are lots of things one can do, and that definitely is an area that could be developed. And I don't know of anything happening in Wisconsin on it. So go for it.
Okay, next question is from Fawn. Do you think restorative justice could work in a case of institutionally sponsored harm, like Jacob Blake's shooting? If the Racine Police Department, or possibly the Kenosha Police Department, were to engage participants in racial justice in this case, it could change not only the whole of Racine and Kenosha, but communities across Wisconsin and beyond.
The answer is yes. It is difficult to put in restorative justice in the middle of a crisis because there is some real need for quiet and contemplation and getting people's trust. And it's a little hard to do when everybody is reacting, you know, as one does to that kind of tragedy. But let me say this, that one of my students tried to do racial profiling issue with police department. And this a number of years ago. And it was interesting because we worked with some high school kids. It turned out to be all boys. That was just a coincidence, but it was boys of color. And we had a police department that was willing to meet with them and they were going to go through experiences. And the first thing, our first roadblock was their parents, the boys' parents, did not want their boys to sit down with police and tell stories because they worried that these kids were going to get targeted, which is telling in of itself, right? And, you know, I said to the police department, well, we're not there. And so we wound up working with the boys for some time and they actually eventually, we were still using disposable cameras. We gave them cameras and they took pictures of doors they felt comfortable walking in and doors they felt uncomfortable walking in. And they created a slideshow of these doors, and some of them were they're schools, some doors on other not doors, restaurants, certain things. And then we wanted them to maybe go into, you know, we had sort of our desires to have them go talk to community groups and things. Again, they didn't want to risk that. And so they wound up doing the presentation to their parents, which was extremely powerful because their parents, to learn that their kids were facing some of the same issues that their parents had faced a generation earlier, was deeply disturbing to them. And their parents started relating the stories. I tell you that story because you have to go with the groups and the culture of the group and where they are in order to work on those things. That being said, that's the only way it's going to work. The only way it's going to work is for police to know people who have committed crimes, and people who have committed crimes to better understand police. We had one in a circle, and we'll tell a long story, but he'd been incarcerated 3 times. He got out. He said in our circle that he was going to return to crime because he wasn't finding a job. And he said, it's a joke. Anybody thinks I'm going to find a job. And I'd like to have my son home, but that's not going to happen. And this old-time cop who was in our circle went up to him and handed him a card and said, if you're sincere about that, you come and see me at District 5. And so we ended, and the young man said to one of our facilitators, I've never had a cop talk to me like that. Well, he shows up at District 5 and the cop says, well, you know what, I will help you, but I want for 2 weeks for you to be here at 8 o'clock every morning so I know you're going to show up if you get a job, which the guy did. And the next thing you know, the cop and the community prosecutor started going out on interviews with the guy to support him in trying to get a job. And eventually the cop talked an employer who had already, he said, I was ripped off by somebody else who was on parole. And the cop said, I think he's sincere. Give him a job. You have a problem, you can call me. And the guy wound up being employee of the month 2 months in a row and was still employed a year later. And so that's how it's supposed to work. And it's not fast, it's not easy, but the answer is yes, is to try. But you know, some of it has to be tried not in the heat of a particular event or later on an event, but it has to be a constant. It has to be trying to create those bridges between law enforcement, not only with people who have been convicted, but community and people that the cops need to get along with, and community connecting with other communities. And so, you know, I think the whole world needs a circle, but that's me.
Great, thank you so much. We have several more questions. I don't know how many more you have time to take, Janine.
I'm hanging in there. I'm hanging in there. Okay.
Well,
So
we
people
really
have to leave.
appreciate it. Okay, so Barbie Jackson had a couple of questions. I'll read her first one. Many of the Dane County Community Restorative Court Circles have been unable to get victims to participate in the restorative circles. What might they do to be more successful at this, as it is such a critical element?
That's a great question. And I didn't have a chance to talk about the restorative courts in Madison, which are wonderful. And in fact, they're very uncommon. And so I give Ron Johnson a huge round of applause for putting that together. It's really important about how that the presentation of an opportunity for a victim offender meeting or circle or conference or whatever it's going to be is given to a victim. And I think there has to be a combination of things. I think, you know, there has to be materials, whether it's a video or whether it's other things, testaments from other victims who participated and why they appreciate that opportunity. Frankly, if I were trying to do it, I would have a social, I mean, in the ideal world, I would have a social worker and a survivor of another crime who's participated in one sit down and offer a meeting to a victim to say, this is what happened. They're worried about not being safe, and they have every reason to believe that they weren't safe as a victim. And so it's going to have to build some trust. And part of building trust is to hear from other victims why they felt safe in the process. So how they're told and offer that, if you just say, gee, would you like to sit down and have a conversation or come into court and have a conversation with the offender, you know, 99.9% of people are going to say, no, thanks. I don't want that. So there's got to be a way to build up their confidence in it, that it's going to be safe. We always talk about creating a safe environment for a difficult conversation, and somebody who they trust has got to be able to convey that to them.
Thank you so much. So did you say you had to leave in 5 minutes, or did you say that you could take a few more questions?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm okay.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Eugene Chrysler. I was just released, and one of the gentlemen who had been sentenced with me was sentenced as a juvenile. Can you give me your understanding on what's being done, if anything, for children who are being sentenced to life, which does nothing for their well-being as they lose their lives before it even starts?
Yeah, you know, that is out of my area of working. That is a serious problem, and I know that a number of groups have been working with the sentencing for life. For those, you know, there's a real question. They have to have eligibility for parole or release under a U.S. Supreme Court case, but that's a better question for Jerry Hancock, who does more of that kind of work than me. So, Jerry, do you want to try it?
Yeah, sure. I was on the Supreme Court, so I would know this better than you, Justice Geske.
Thanks, Jerry.
I know that the person who has been doing the most work on this very issue is Brian Stevenson. And so if you go and look online for Brian Stevenson, he can explain to you exactly where the law is. There were a couple of important Supreme Court cases authored by Judge Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, that did deal with the issue of juvenile brain development and recognize that as a real issue, a real thing. And so it's a growing body of evidence and a growing body of case law. But I would look for Brian Stevenson, and he is the lawyer who argued those cases in the Supreme Court.
Let me
Thank
just
you.
add, Brian is with Hawaii. It's Bryan. And those of you who've seen the movie or read the book, Just Mercy, he's the lawyer and author of that book. So
Thank you. Yes. And okay, so we have several more questions. I'm going to group a couple of them, but first we have one from Lisa
Okay.
Hahnemann. Do you think there is a way to track recidivism with the offenders besides looking up past crimes committed on CCAP? Is recidivism the key factor? Can community look at racial justice as victim-centered and not use numbers and stats or statistics? Why is it a hard sell to our community?
Oh, a lot of questions there. There are studies, and I can't tell you where they are. You know, I know the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and maybe UW-Madison have done, there are a lot of their criminal justice work has looked at things more than just statistics. And actually Michael O'Hare, apostrophe H-E-A-R, who's a law professor at Marquette, does a lot on sentencing in Wisconsin. He's written quite a bit on it. So there are other studies on that issue. And you know, victim-centered is tough because it as much as I believe in it, I'll tell you why I always hesitate. Now, I'm a big victim supporter, but I remember as a judge, when I'm sentencing, I can have two defendants in front of me having committed the same crime, and one victim asking for mercy and one asking for the maximum sentence. And the question is, am I listening to the victims on this case? Do they control what I ought to be, even weighing them any differently than each other? And that becomes a hard question. And you know, it becomes real obvious on domestic violence cases, serious domestic violence cases, where somebody's been shot multiple times, and then the victim, often a woman, comes in and says, I think he didn't really mean it, and I think he ought to get probation. And the question is, how victim-centered am I? And so it's complex in deciding on sentencing issues. But I think, you know, we've moved away from that, at least globally as a community discussion, from, what's happening at a particular victim to the sense that everybody who gets sentenced is bad. And no matter what the crime is, they're a bad person. And, you know, no matter what their record is, they're a bad person. Sometimes they're a worse person. And, you know, there's very little individual analysis by community on these cases. And I used to say, even sometimes when they used to write about cases in the paper, I'd go home at night and read a case and I'd think, what judge did that? And I'd get to the bottom and it was my case and I didn't even recognize it. And so you know, when the sense that people say, oh, judges are too soft on crime. Well, how do we get to overcrowding if judges are too soft on crime?
Thank you.
I mean, we make these community leaps that make no sense. And so part of the problem is the community education. And I think that's huge, to understand what's happening and who's incarcerated. And there are a lot of terms thrown around out there. But, you know, I think it's important that people understand.
For no good reason whatsoever. And then the ones that really need to be in there, y'all ain't got no room for them.
Right.
Thank you. And remember, everybody, if you're not talking, please mute. Please mute yourself so we can all hear Janine. And we can have the host mute in just a second. I'll hop over to the other computer and do that. But we do have another question from Barbie, which kind of ties together with a question from Tara Von Dalen. So I'm going to put them together. So the question from Barbie is, the Dane County DA refers quite a few municipal offenses to the Dane County Community Restorative Court, but we would like to see expansion to more serious crimes. Given the success of restorative practices, do you have any advice for persuading the DA to be more proactive? So that's that question. And then the not dissimilar question from Tara is, can you please address the prevalence of restorative justice in the minds of other judges in Wisconsin and in the US? It sounds like we need more people like you, and maybe there are. Thank you.
In answer to the first question, I guess the only suggestion I have is that he ought to be urged to look at what the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office has had. They have had restorative justice processes. It's not a court, but a restorative justice process for probably 15 years. And they only handle criminal cases. They don't have municipal cases in the DA's office. Now, they've been small offenses, but they've done a lot with first-time delivery of marijuana cases, which can be a felony, And what they've done is community conferencing. So they've trained community conference people and a facilitator, and they sometimes have set conditions out for the person who's charged, and they make sure that he or she understands the harm to the community. And if everything's fulfilled, sometimes it's completely dismissed, sometimes it's reduced to a misdemeanor, sometimes there's something else. And so Erin Katsky is the name of the woman who's run that program forever. And I would urge him to take a look at their program, and maybe, I don't know if they did, I mean, they certainly talk all the time, but I don't know if they've talked about restorative justice. So that's my suggestion on that. Now, my fog brain for forgetting the are there more judges like me? Yeah, there are a lot of judges, I think, that are interested in restorative justice. The problem is it's really hard to fit into a system. And I know I'm very good friends with the chief judge in Milwaukee, Mary Trigiano, and she and I have had long discussions about that. I talked to her about the other day, and right now they're trying to keep their head above water with COVID and get the courts running, and it's hard to do anything system changing. But I think that, I think courts, and I didn't talk about this, but I think a lot of the problem solving courts have moved in part in that direction, dealing with people with bad addictions. A veterans court where often there's PTSD problems, and some other specialized courts that are looking more at the societal impact and looking at treatment and trying to deal with protection of the community in creative ways. So sometimes those courts are moving in that way. And I think there are more judges that are interested. It's just system hard. There's no money for it. People that do this work, I was fortunate for a number of years, I was on faculty at Marquette, so I was paid by them. Now when I do the work, I do it for free. Jerry gets paid a little pittance by his church, right, Jerry? Ron fortunately has been hired by Dane County to do the work that he does. But there's very little money put into the project. And often it's money that's in there for a 2-year project, and then we eliminate it again. And so there's a real need to also to get adequate funding to be able to do these processes, because they're time consuming. And frankly, not all the people that are involved ought to be doing it for free all the time.
Wow.
How about a couple more questions and then I'm.
Oh, well, I think we're pretty good on the questions now, Janine. We're so grateful for all your wisdom. We could sit here and talk forever because there's so much we need to know, and so much we need
to
do.
I come back when I feel better someday.
Oh, may you feel better right away, please. And yes, we have other kinds of gatherings besides like this. We have a monthly Moses meet for all our members, And right now it's all being done virtually, but hopefully there's going to be a day when we can gather
hope so.
together and you can come for something like that too. So I'd love to.
Well, that's what this was supposed to be, but next time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. We'll love to see you again and again and again. And thank you to everyone who participated in any way. Just many of us just got a chance to be here and to share, as we said at the beginning, share our own spirits. So thank you. Thank you. I can't name everybody because I'll forget, but thanks to all who had any part in this. And I think, Rachel, maybe you had one more word for us. Where are you?
I am here,
And I
and
want to
I
thank
already,
Rudy. Rudy, thank you.
yes,
Sorry, go
and
ahead.
I already put in a plug for the gala that's coming up, and that's in the chat. But I also wanted to say, Janine, for not feeling good, you did a wonderful job. Thank you so much.